Alright, I'll be super honest and transparent with you guys up front. This was not a video I'd planned on making. The one I'd actually been cooking up was supposed to come out on the 16th as a little surprise extra video since I haven't made a non-members choice video since September, and would have been called something along the lines of, what happens to the people who still like Overwatch? The whole premise of the video was based on the idea that, as a result of Overwatch's various issues and the release of Rivals, there were a lot of people whose friend groups had effectively moved on without them, and what it means for so many of us whose social lives are so heavily guided by being able to share games with people. And look, that's still a topic I want to explore someday, but it's also one whose premise seems to fall a bit short in light of the massive changes that were announced for Overwatch 2 in the February spotlight. Overwatch is getting perks in the new season, earnable loot boxes are coming back, there's a new game mode coming soon, and for the first time in a long time, it kind of feels like the momentum is slowly swinging back in Overwatch's favor. There's a lot of people who hadn't picked up Overwatch in months who are genuinely excited for it now, and I'll be the first to admit that I'm one of them. The last time I played Overwatch on stream was in October, and since Hazard came out, I've played maybe an hour or two of it total. I'd never even tried him myself, and had no real interest in doing so. And remember, for context, in the grand scheme of things, I've historically been an Overwatch content creator. Most of my biggest videos are Overwatch videos. It was my most played game forever. It was the one I used for background footage for everything. I had every incentive to stick with it. But I just couldn't bring myself to stay invested in it after all these years. It's not because Overwatch was a dead game or whatever, it's because I started playing it when I was 17 and I turned 27 this year. Things change in your life over time. And yet, post-Spotlight, I'm looking forward to Overwatch 2 a lot more, maybe more than I ever have. I'm writing this part of the video before the new season drops with all the changes, by the way, so who's to say how it'll all play out in the end, but this is probably the most excited I've been about Overwatch since Overwatch 2's release. That in and of itself could be a topic worth exploring in a separate video. After all, the fact that Overwatch is still able to be compelling to people after so long and after so many missteps is a pretty interesting phenomenon. But I want to take a different approach in this one. Something interesting that happened immediately after the spotlight is that people started trying to fit this new development into this ongoing narrative about Overwatch. This decade-long story that saw Overwatch start as the new game-changing up-and-comer in 2016 only to fall from grace as it kept making and breaking promises. The narrative that Overwatch overcame all these potential Overwatch killers right up until Marvel Rivals took it down, and only then did they finally get desperate enough to make the big changes necessary to save the game. The narrative that they saw the pushback to Riot for getting rid of free Hex Tech chests and decided to reintroduce free loot boxes back into Overwatch. The narrative that Deadlock or Supervive or any number of other smaller games provided the inspiration necessary for Overwatch 2 to improve itself, saving it once again from irrelevance even as the entire gaming culture seemed to revel in the fall of the Titan. To me, the construction of this narrative is far more interesting than what the narrative itself is trying to do. After all of this is obviously a gross oversimplification. Massive games don't just change on a dime like this in terms of adding new mechanics, new monetization models, new modes, and more. Valeria Rodriguez, the VA for Venture, has talked about how they were recording voice lines for Venture 2 years ago, more than a year before Venture was even released, meaning that other voice actors were probably doing this even earlier, that are only now going to be used for Stadium. Blizzard's been pretty open in the past about how things are often in the pipeline for years before they're finally released. If people stopped and thought for a second, they'd obviously acknowledge that Blizzard isn't bringing back loot boxes just because Riot announced in November of 2024 that they were going to phase out free Hex Tech chests in favor of a Battle Pass system. Valeria's comments demonstrate that Stadium's been on Blizzard's mind since at least early 2023, and realistically probably much longer given that perks have been bounced around as a part of Overwatch 2 since before it even launched. We can even see the experimentation with them throughout event modes over the last few years, going back to stuff like the Trials of Sanctuary Halloween event in 2023. And yet, in spite of all that, the narrative continues to be constructed, and I want to talk about it. Part 1. The narrative framing. If you're not chronically online in a very specific way, there are two concepts I'm going to introduce you to really quickly that I think are actually kind of useful for our purposes. The Kia Asylum and reheating nachos. The Kia Asylum is a stan culture concept referencing American rapper Kia and is used to describe a pop star, could be anyone but usually a pop star, who's locked in irrelevance for the foreseeable future with no escape route in sight. This could be someone who's always bubbling under but never really popping off, your Ava Maxes, your Zara Larsons, your Kim Petrases, etc. But it could also be someone who was once big but is seemingly unable to recapture what they once had, like a Camila Cabello or a Dua Lipa or maybe a Katy Perry, although her discography might be too strong for her to ever truly be committed to the asylum. Escape is possible, see Chappell Roan or Sabrina Carpenter or maybe Charlie XCX depending on your politics for examples, but it's unlikely, and looking a little too desperate to escape can seal your fate. For people who don't care about pop music, other entities that are in the Kia Asylum are the United Kingdom, the Edmonton Oilers, and Mitch McConnell. Reheating nachos is also a stan culture term, this time born from a 2023 video that honestly has very little to do with its current use, so we're not going to spend too much time on it. The original use was like, oh, you want their nachos, as in, oh, you want what they have. Simple, straightforward, easy. Everyone wanted Doja Cat's nachos in the early 2020s after Say So, and everyone wanted Lord's nachos after Royals in the early 2010s. Reheated nachos are a bit more complicated. It implies that you are actively trying to take something that someone, maybe even yourself, once had but have since abandoned. This can be a positive or a negative thing, depending on context. Lady Gaga reheating her nachos from the Fame era with Abracadabra is broadly being treated as a positive, but if you said that Tate McRae is reheating Britney Spears and Nelly Furtado's nachos, it probably wouldn't be a compliment. Again, for those who don't follow pop music, you could say that Mark Carney is trying to reheat Pierre Trudeau's nachos, or that the Four Nations Face-Off is reheating the NHL All-Star Games nachos successfully, maybe, depending on, again, your politics. Or that Elon Musk is reheating Rasputin's nachos with hopefully similar end results. Now, the reason I bring these up is because these terms pretty succinctly sum up the vibes that have surrounded Overwatch over the last few years. If gaming had a Kia Asylum, most people probably would have put Overwatch 2 in it, especially after the PvE kerfuffle. Kerfuffle? Am I 80? It was once big, but seemed incapable of recapturing what it once had. Importantly, the Kia Asylum doesn't mean that you don't still get streams as an artist or players as a game, nor does it mean that there's not still quality stuff in the discography or patch notes. Rather, it's a statement of pop culture irrelevance, of faded glory, or of unrealized potential. The Kia Asylum is for artists who deserved better, as well as artists who refused to give up even when the chips were stacked against them, deserved or not. And the discussion of reheated nachos, frankly, shocking that this hasn't become a lone word in the gaming world, given how it's all anyone fucking talks about. Is Marvel Rivals reheating Overwatch 1's nachos? Does Overwatch 2 want Marvel Rivals reheated Overwatch 1 nachos? One could argue that the Spotlight Showcase was really more of a showcase of the various nachos Overwatch 2 had reheated from any number of other games, depending on which Kia Asylum inmate you personally stan. Is it Supervive? Deadlock? Paladins? Maybe a few from bigger games like Rivals and League? The Overwatch League was an esports attempt to reheat the NHL's and NBA's and MLB's nachos and failed, leaving Overwatch's competitive scene kinda in the Kia Asylum as of time of recording. Both terms, Kia Asylum and reheating nachos, are attempts to contextualize the framework of the narrative you're trying to build. The Kia Asylum is a setting, a metaphorical one, but still. It is the starting point of a heroic journey if you're escaping it, and the endpoint of a tragedy if you get committed. It is a way of turning the abstract concept of pop culture obscurity into a tangible thing that your narrative can be built around. Reheated nachos are a way of, again, turning an abstract concept into a tangible one. It's acknowledging the things once held and now lost, the glory days of the past that now feel long gone. And a way to concisely explain someone's attempts to revisit those glory days. It's the framework through which you can view a redemption narrative for someone or something whose golden age is past that they want to reclaim, but also the framework through which you can explore someone's attempts, successful or unsuccessful, to usurp someone else's throne to become their successor. And in the context of Overwatch, we've seen a lot of this over the years. A big part of the problem, however, is when are you going to set the starting point of the story? The golden age is always sometime in the past, and irrelevancy is a hard thing to measure in the first place. Overwatch's golden age has routinely shifted around in people's memories, especially back when it was actually happening. And the argument around its relevance is... well, it's hard to say, isn't it? I said in my video, The Myth of the Overwatch Killer, that people make Overwatch unkillable by always centering it in discussions of other games like Rivals, and I do stand by that. But it's also undeniable that it's no longer the pop culture phenomenon it once was. Kia is, ironically enough, able to survive in pop culture as long as she's treated as the synonym for pop culture irrelevance, which makes the Kia Asylum itself a bit of a contradiction. But regardless, when, if ever, did Overwatch enter the Kia Asylum in this narrative we're constructing? The reason why this is important to understand is that when we see these narratives online about how Overwatch is responding to Marvel Rivals, or League, or Deadlock, or Paladins, or Supervive, or any number of other games over the years, they don't just pop into existence out of whole cloth. The framework of the narrative rarely changes, just the terminology and where we put the start date. Even if Overwatch does miraculously pull off a comeback here, it doesn't erase these parts of the framework. Instead, they're incorporated into its new success. It was once in the Kia Asylum, but it reheated everyone's leftover nachos in an air fryer, and now it's back on top. If it fails, we do the same in reverse. Overwatch's descent into the Kia Asylum was guaranteed once it tried and failed to reheat everyone else's nachos out of a desperate last stand. If you're angry at Overwatch's success for whatever reason, you'll say that it only got there by copying those who succeeded first. If you're happy about Overwatch's success and don't like the games that were previously beating it, you'll argue that Overwatch took a flop and turned it into fashion, to misquote Mike's Mike misquoting Lil Nas X. Part of what makes this sort of stan culture narrative building fascinating to me is that it is largely organic, as in constructed in real time by third parties rather than anyone actually involved. Blizzard, NetEase, or Riot aren't trying to push these narratives themselves. They're built by fans and haters and community members and content creators and journalists and Twitter accounts pretending they're doing journalism, all trying to collectively make sense of what's going on in the world. And yes, sometimes that's done with ulterior motives. There's money to be made for people who know how to jump on the bandwagon right, and over the next few weeks you'll see a lot of people coming back to Overwatch and making 10 videos a week on it who said it was dead because of Rivals a month ago. However, it goes beyond that. People impose narratives on real-world unscripted events because that's a lot of how we experience the world. Through media, through narrative. The real world is messy and chaotic and often incoherent, so putting it in a narrative framework is a natural impulse for us when we're trying to make sense of events. The Kia Asylum establishes the state of Overwatch, and the reheating of nachos establishes their principal mission in order to achieve their goals of getting back on top. This sort of thing can be really useful, especially for analyzing events in broad strokes, but it's also inherently an oversimplification that risks losing the important nuances. For example, the Overwatch sucks narrative often fails to reckon with the reality that Bobby Kotick was basically sabotaging the game for the entire time he was CEO of Blizzard. But if Overwatch starts doing well, that fact will be brought into a more central part of the framework to explain why a game that's now good was once bad. Same with the layoffs that happened a year ago after the Microsoft acquisition. People will spin that however suits their needs. And again, remember, this narrative is borderline wholly unrelated to the actual success of Overwatch. Overwatch's player base or revenue or Twitch viewership are all stats that will be rolled out by the stands if they're looking good or the antis if they're looking bad, regardless of whether or not they're actually good or bad. And they'll be cherry-picked if at all possible to make them look however they need to look. And that brings us on to the next section. Part 2. The narrative spin. Once your framework's established, it's time to start spinning the events of the real world to try and fit the narrative you want to see play out. But how? Well, let's look at fiction media, non-fiction media, and then reality as a guide for different ways to do it. For fictional media, it's obvious. You construct events yourself based on what you want to fit into where if you're the creator, and as the audience, you know that every element of that fictional narrative is deliberate. No car accident happens without a reason. Nobody dies without a reason. Nobody's present in a scene without a reason. Even if that reason is just that the author wanted it to happen. The audience then has the job of constructing the external, broader narrative to understand it, typically in the form of fan theories and fan fiction that collectively come to form the fanon, the fan canon. Part of why you can do fan fiction for fictional stories is that the knowledge of intentionality of every single aspect of fiction allows you to engage with it much more easily, especially if it's written in a book or script. If a book constantly describes a character as moody and moping and depressed, then you can take that as fact. Usually, unless there's an unreliable narrator. In the real world, or even just media that's live action, it's a lot harder to read people and know how they're feeling. But with that kind of fiction, there's a lot more concrete awareness of what details exist and matter. For nonfiction, we've got two broad categories. Nonfiction that's presented as information, and nonfiction that's presented as entertainment. A biography of Queen Elizabeth II would be the first, The Crown would be the second. These are both attempts to look back on history and put it all into a coherent narrative, either by writing out what happened in order and drawing the connecting lines, or trying to condense reality into a more digestible version of itself. Those aren't as helpful to us here as reality television, though, where real-world events will happen and then get processed through editors and turned into a narrative. This is especially important in competition shows, where story editors and producers are a big part of the process. Like RuPaul's Drag Race has people whose sole job is to try and track all the ongoing social dynamics and events and successes and failures and arguments and everything else and turn those into storylines. On paper, Hormonalisa was a contestant from the current season who was supposed to be eliminated but then got saved by the Badonkadonk tank. Don't ask. She was then saved for 2 episodes, high for 1, and then eliminated. This is where the framework matters. Hormonalisa's narrative is shaped by the Pick by Ru framework that she and production established for her, based on her handing her audition USB drive to RuPaul personally at an event instead of doing it the normal way. This was repeatedly emphasized by her in the final edit that we saw through the conversations and confessionals we were shown with both Hormona and the other queens, with it being solidified by her being saved by the Badonkadonk tank gimmick. Again, don't ask. Every placement she had after that point was then spun to fit the narrative, that she was being protected, that she was being favored, and her eventual elimination was just kind of proof that she could only be carried so far in the minds of some. Instead of just a queen being saved by a gimmick, which happened to one other queen on that same season, the Picked by Ru framework means that the event needs to be spun into being rigged to protect Ru's favorite by the fans. If it was a different queen, the spin could have been different. Diabetti and Bosco were both queens who were eliminated and then saved by gimmicks in season 14 of the show, and the spin on both of them was very different. Dia was eliminated early and then brought back and was the drag daughter of recent fan favorite queen Crystal Method, so her framework was something to prove. Bosco was a broke barista who was able to survive in the competition with her bra and panty combos on pure talent, giving her a Chi-Chi DeVayne-esque money can't buy talent framework to spin from. All three queens, Hormona, Bosco, and Daya, were eliminated fair and square, and then were able to continue in the competition as the result of a gimmick. But none of them were given a similar narrative. That's editorial spin. The editors of Drag Race are taking days and days worth of events over the span of about a month and condensing it all down into a few hours, picking storylines for everyone to make it as enjoyable as possible. Sometimes this is favorable, sometimes less so. And queens blaming their poor reception on the show's editing was once so widespread that RuPaul literally released a song titled Blame It on the Edit, where she basically says that it's just a cope. However, then we have reality. Reality TV helps us see how this can be done for entertainment, but when we're talking about the narrative of Overwatch's rise and fall, that falls short. This narrative isn't part of an entertainment product. Rather, it's a meta-narrative about an entertainment product. Just like with reality TV, we can't process everything that happened in the most literal, unfiltered sense. There's not enough hours in the day. So instead, we have to condense it into something that we can make sense of. Think about how we talk about history. Don't invade Russia in the winter, or Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires, are both examples of establishing a framework that we then use to spin events when trying to construct a narrative, even though, obviously, reality isn't so simple. Afghanistan's status as the graveyard of empires is complicated. The British, Soviets, and Americans all got involved there for different reasons, and all failed there for different reasons that aren't just magic country that kills superpowers. Likewise, Russia doesn't just magically repel invasions that start after October, and not every failure plays out the same. France and Germany had wildly different outcomes when they invaded Russia, with Germany coming far closer to success than France. But they also failed for dramatically different reasons that included cold weather, but also went far beyond just the temperature. Plus, Germany's a cold country too, and it very much so got invaded, as did other countries that were much further north than it. It's more complicated than just a thermostat. But we make narratives regardless because that's how we make sense of a complicated scenario. And also spin them to serve our interests. For example, who benefits from that narrative about Russia? That no one can invade in the winter? Well, anyone who wants to downplay the role of the USSR and the Red Army in the fall of Nazi Germany. By spinning the story as Mother Nature fucked them up in the East and then the non-communist allies landed at Normandy to liberate everyone, it credits the capitalist West and an act of God, and downplays the role of the communists, which was useful for the Cold War narrative that followed. It can also benefit Russia though. Having a reputation for being undefeatable for 6 months out of the year is a pretty good one to have for self-defense, especially if your enemies are democracies whose people will respond with, "It's stupid to invade them in the winter," even if the people with actual expertise and decision-making power know something they don't. Same with Afghanistan. Treating it as the graveyard of empires absolves the people and nations who made the poor decisions regarding military intervention in Afghanistan of some of the blame by crediting it to some mystical anti-empire power that the country has. But Afghanistan also benefits if the people of every major power on Earth look at their country and see it as a fast track towards their country no longer being a major power. Now, when we're talking about Overwatch, we're talking on a much smaller scale, obviously, but the spin is being done for all the same reasons. Once we have the framework established, every new event has to be factored into the narrative and spun to suit your needs. Take the release of Brigitte, who brought with her the rise of goats, the death of Dive, and the emergence of a much slower meta in general. If you liked Overwatch at the time and liked Brigitte, you'd point out that she makes the game much more accessible for people, that she's a strong counter to a lot of dominant heroes who are otherwise very hard to stop, and that she was balanced out by a ton of limitations on stuff like her range, mobility, and damage. If you liked Overwatch before her but not after, you'd point out that she makes the game too accessible, she lowers the skill ceiling, and makes too many high-skill heroes functionally redundant without requiring an equal level of skill to counter them. Eventually, with enough spin and time, the latter narrative was what stuck. And then a little bit later in the late 2010s, when people were talking about the death of Overwatch, this was a fundamental part of the narrative. Community consensus had settled on Brig being a net negative for Overwatch and identified her release as the beginning of the end of either the Golden Age or the game as a whole. And yes, there was the content drought and the Overwatch League kind of flopping and the loot boxes and all the Blizzard controversies and all this other stuff, but in 2019, if you ask people when Overwatch began filing out the paperwork to be admitted to the Kia Asylum, they probably would have assumed you were insane until you explained what you meant, at which point they probably would have pointed to Brig. And look, I still stand by that. I think that Brig did a lot of damage to this game's meta, but that's neither here nor there. Now though, it's different. The spin has changed. Brig's no longer the Overwatch killer. Instead, the community has settled on 5v5, or the cancellation of PvE, or the removal of loot boxes and introduction of the shop and battle pass. The death of the Overwatch League is pointed to as an indicator of the game's fall from grace rather than a cause, even though the Overwatch League basically struggled for its entire life and never really figured out how to make itself work long before the move to Overwatch 2. Initially, some of the spin was that it was just because of COVID, which obviously had an effect, but as people became less charitable towards Overwatch 2, they were less willing to accept that spin. A lot of the blame for a long time has fallen on Kiriko, due to both her strength as well as her favoritism from Blizzard in terms of skins. Venture has come to be seen as, like, a victim in all of this, neglected by Blizzard in favor of another 3 trillion skins to Mercy and Kiriko, and now Juno is seemingly getting that part of the narrative attached to her as well. When people were excited for Overwatch 2, they hyped up Push as a replacement for 2CP. Now that they aren't, they yearn for 6v6 2CP and hate Push. When they didn't like Overwatch 1, they said that the new monetization model would be better. When they didn't like Overwatch 2, they said they wanted to return to the old ways. And again, some of this is cynically motivated. There are plenty of content creators who make a lot of money pumping out videos to try and capitalize on and exacerbate the narrative. They're, frankly, rarely coherent enough storytellers to invent the narrative themselves, but they magnify the community's narratives and blow them so out of proportion that every flaw seems catastrophic, and every success is treated as biblical. There are also people who are just brain-rotted and hallucinate conspiracies out of nothing, as seen by an update that happened while I was working on this video. On February 18th, the same day as Season 15 went live with a bunch of the Overwatch changes, there were a bunch of layoffs in NetEase's Seattle offices, and people with CTE from bashing their heads against their keyboards 24/7 decided that this was because Overwatch is returning to China, and so NetEase is... what, running scared? Closing up shop? Keep in mind, NetEase is also the company that runs Overwatch in China, like that's who they had to make that deal with. So honestly, if anything, they're getting a win-win here. However, beyond that, a year ago I made a video about the layoffs at Blizzard and why they happen, and the same reasons hold true here. The gaming industry doesn't treat its workers well. The added wrinkle here is that American workers are uniquely unprotected in their employment compared to basically everywhere else on the planet, but especially China, where NetEase is based. Those firings would have been impossible under Chinese law, but they happened in America to cut costs and make more money now that the game's out. Rivals has been doing just fine competing against Overwatch globally and isn't going anywhere anytime soon, and it's not being carried by having some exclusive access to the Chinese market or whatever. But again, narrative spin. The momentum's going in Overwatch's favor a bit more now, so a lot of people are going to either cynically try and turn everything into a part of that narrative or just hallucinate a conspiracy where there isn't one. This same thing happened a year ago when Rivals was announced back in March. Like, you can go back and look at how people talked about that announcement. The only positive thing I can say about these people who hallucinate these sorts of things are that I don't think they're actively malicious. They're not necessarily cynical, they're just brain broken by being online too much. But a lot of this comes from people who are just trying to figure out why the game they once loved doesn't do it for them anymore. It's boring to just settle on, well, it's not for me anymore, or, well, I played 1,000 hours of this over the last decade and I'm not the same person as I was in 2016. Or just something else is more fun to me right now. Those put the onus on us for what's going on and how we're feeling. It isn't narratively satisfying to just be like, well, I guess my feelings have changed. It's like the end of a relationship. It's not satisfying if someone's just kind of like, I just don't think we're getting along. Like, it helps to have some sort of event to be able to point to process what's happening to you, right? So instead, we feel the need to understand it within this broad narrative context, the stuff that's happening across the Overwatch community, the gaming industry, or even just society at large. Sometimes Overwatch's narrative is being influenced by people who want to use it to push a separate narrative. People who are in favor of the rollback of queer rights and the rise of bigoted legislation and sentiments will say that Overwatch is failing because of a bigger pushback against wokeness, while pointing to what they think are non-woke games like Marvel Rivals succeeding. Which is silly if you know anything about Marvel, but also if you know anything about Overwatch's past. Overwatch's diversity was a big successful selling point of the game for years, and it's hard to see how someone can think Marvel is anti-woke and on some red-pilled, right-wing, brain-rot bullshit unless they literally can't read. And also, when you remember that some of the biggest pushback against its queer characters in the early days was mostly from other queer people who felt that Soldier and Tracer being gay was handled pretty shallowly. I mean, I also made a video talking about that stuff ages ago. People acted like Lifeweaver was released to distract from scandals at Blizzard as if his release wasn't following the same schedule as every other new Overwatch 2 hero. And that him being a lot more visibly fruity was a sign that they were either trying to pinkwash or just pander because they were desperate. For a year or so, post Lifeweaver, every new hero announcement was met with, uh-oh, what are they trying to cover up now? But eventually it faded because it just didn't really pan out. The narrative spin didn't really do much for them after that one. And that actually brings me to the last section of this video. Part 3. The narrative payoff. So, we've set the framework and spun the events to fit our narrative. But at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves why. Like, what's the point? And, well, the point is the payoff. It's to give ourselves a coherent story that we can follow through to its conclusion, wherever that conclusion might be. If the new changes to Overwatch revitalize the game and put it back on top, then the narrative will probably be that Overwatch was finally kicked into gear by Rivals and fixed its shit. And that the people who stuck through it through its dark ages are the ride or dies, even if a lot of those same people would have pushed back against the notion that Overwatch was flopping at the time. If the changes don't fix it, then it's a desperate last-ditch attempt to stop its player base from bleeding out to Marvel rivals, and the death of something that was once great but couldn't stop failing itself. Part of the challenge here, then, is deciding when the story's truly over. Overwatch's meta-narrative has ended a bunch of times. It ended after the Golden Age, it ended after the start of the content drought, it ended with Overwatch 2's release, it ended with PvE's cancellation, and so on. Different people have closed the book at different points in Overwatch's history, and they do so when they feel like the story, or at least it's relevant to their lives, is over. Other people have insisted the whole time that the story's not over, and those people are still trying to factor in more and more events to try and make sense of it all. To make a more neutral comparison, think of No Man's Sky, the game that had a bunch of hype in advance and then massively let everyone down. For a lot of people, that was where they assumed the narrative would end. But then, over the years, No Man's Sky continued to improve, eventually surpassing what was initially promised and becoming a story of redemption, of perseverance, and success, instead of a story of the gaming community's tendency to overhype things and the hubris involved in overpromising and underdelivering. Where did No Man's Sky's story end? When did its meta-narrative conclude? Has it concluded? What about Paladins, to bring it a bit closer to home here? Paladins has always been lurking in Overwatch's shadow, owing mostly to a really unfortunate shared release point. It's had a small but loyal fanbase who stuck around, but just this year the game was officially cancelled. No more updates or support are coming for Paladins anymore. So, when did Paladins' narrative end? Did Overwatch finally kill it? Did Rivals? If you close the book on it at the same time as Battleborn, does anything about this change the narrative for you? If you stuck around, was it worth it? Is this the narrative payoff that you expected? Even if you didn't want it, is it something that you could have seen coming? We construct these narratives because we want to use them to make sense of what's happening in our relationship to it, but also to try and understand where things are going. We want to be able to predict things. Someone who loves Overwatch is trying to put together the pieces in a way that spells success, and someone who hates it is trying to do the same in reverse. And for both parties, the end goal is to reach the narrative payoff that they're looking for. In large part, this is done because the unpredictability of the world is scary. Being able to predict things, being able to feel like you have some knowledge of what's coming helps, even if it's just the little things like a game you like. If you think Overwatch sucks, you're contextualizing everything in terms of what has to happen in order for the servers to finally shut down, so every failure is another nail in the coffin and every success isn't enough to change the course of fate. If you want it to thrive, you fixate on every success as a glimmer of hope in the darkness. You recall that it was once great and can be great again, and you see the failures as the darkness before the dawn. And if you're undecided, these two narratives are competing for your attention, and you might buy into one or the other depending on how compelling they are to you. However, that's not really enough, is it? It's not just personal, because this sort of narrative construction isn't just personal. It's a very public performance of your perspective and your side in all of this. The payoff isn't just getting the outcome you wanted, but being seen as correct and on the right side. It's about constructing a narrative that contextualizes you as the good guy and the people on the other side as the bad guys. If you love Overwatch, the people who dipped to play Rivals and called Overwatch a dead game who are now crawling back are traitors, and the haters are people who refuse to just let people enjoy things. Or they're hypocrites. They point to an expensive cosmetic in Overwatch and conveniently leave out that an equivalent cosmetic exists in another game and is more expensive. They want to win because they want to see Overwatch succeed, but also because it's a defeat of everyone who's been praying for its downfall. The haters, meanwhile, see themselves as criticizing a game that keeps flopping but refuses to die from a company embroiled in HR violations and breast milk theft, and its defenders as uncritical simps who refuse to acknowledge the reality of what's happening. Everyone wants to win. It's not just personal narrative building, but public, and that means the payoff is public too. To bring out another pop culture example, we could look at the Megan versus Nicki beef of 2024, but I'm not actually interested in starting beef with the Barbs, so let's look at Drake versus Kendrick instead. Or rather, the year-long process of Kendrick trying to get Drake to kill himself by getting increasingly big and important crowds to sing along with him as he calls Drake a pedophile. Yes, there are real-world events happening, but there's also narrative, and the spin that comes as a result. You've got Kendrick the Pulitzer winner versus Drake the pop star. Kendrick who's really from the streets versus Drake who's really from Degrassi. Kendrick who cares about important things versus Drake who doesn't turn a rap album into a lecture. Supporting Kendrick isn't just about supporting Kendrick, but also opposing Drake and all the shit he's gotten up to and all that he represents. There's a bigger payoff than just a Wikipedia page about the beef that's formatted like a page about an actual war. Drake represents something bigger narratively within the collective consciousness, and Kendrick being put in opposition with him means that their similarities and differences take on a bigger meaning for everyone. People who see an entire Super Bowl stadium or Grammys crowd singing along with the A minor line don't just see it as them enjoying a song, but as this sort of tacit statement of support for his side and a blow to Drake. Kendrick versus Drake is obviously explicitly adversarial, but this sort of narrative building doesn't require that. Overwatch isn't explicitly at odds with the various games that people have compared it to over its lifetime, but if it helps you spin your narrative one way or the other, they can be incorporated. Katy Perry versus Lady Gaga is a pop culture beef that stretches back almost 2 decades at this point, and Katy Cat spent 2024 fighting the little monsters like their lives depended on it over whether 314 was a bigger flop than anything Gaga had put out recently. They said she couldn't chart without a feature, and that she hadn't had a hit in years, or whatever else. Now we've got Abracadabra, and the little monsters can turn that narrative on the Katy Cats even though they fought against the premise of it last year, because Abracadabra is doing better than Woman's World, both in terms of, I think, chart performance, but certainly in terms of public perception. For a personal example, a few years back, my family was talking about pop stars that were famous but not, like, big. Like, not huge. They were successful, but they weren't, like, A-listers, whatever. Like, who kind of hovers under the line? And I said Charlie XCX. And at the time, my siblings really latched onto that, insisting that she was not famous or big and that Boom Clap was her only big song. They were wrong then, obviously, but fast forward to 2024 and Brat Summer, which proved me undeniably correct. She is still famous, and she proved it by having one of the most influential albums of the year to boot. And yet, my siblings just said they'd never heard of it, so she clearly wasn't all that big. Objectively speaking, they're wrong here. And if we were just talking about this as pure objective facts, a retelling of history, that wouldn't be hard for them to admit. But now it's a point of pride. And a conflict. The fact that I was right means that I might have more of a finger on the pulse of pop culture than them, and that might imply that they're falling behind in some way. And this does go both ways too. I have my blind spots as well. My brother has stuck by Sabrina Carpenter for a shockingly long time because he liked her on Disney Channel. And if you'd asked me about her in 2022, I probably would not have predicted her success. He would be holding that over me if we'd ever had that fight. My sister's been a diehard Swiftie over the years through good times and bad, and a decade ago I would have died on the hill that she'd fade out, well, she would have said she was going to last forever. And we've all been wrong about somebody one time or another as well. Our household has, in fact, had Cody Simpson fans in it. Not me, and I'm not going to say who, but they were there. We all take our L's. The narrative payoff is, at least in part, being right when someone else was wrong. It's about proving that you not only established the correct framework, but that you collected the right pieces of reality and spun them correctly to identify what was going to happen, and that there were other people who got it wrong. It's about the people who thought that nobody would ever return to Overwatch being proven wrong in the eyes of the people who see the spotlight as the beginning of a bright new future. It's about their loyalty being proven right in the long run, even as others abandon them, making it less and less popular to be correct. It's about feeling like Jesus being booed for telling the truth, and about getting back at all the people who compared Overwatch to every other game to try and tear it down. Nobody who spends 30 seconds thinking about it genuinely believes that loot boxes are a response to hex tech chess, but it just feels good to be able to put Overwatch in the favorable position in these matchups for once. Overwatch adding a free way to get new cosmetics is in sharp contrast with every other game whittling them away, which feels like a victory. The payoff is in seeing all these YouTubers and Twitch streamers who made bank off of decrying the death of Overwatch as they flocked to rivals now posting the "Is Overwatch back?" question mark videos and streaming the new season. It's about seeing your fave emerge from the Kia Asylum reborn for a new era. To be a little monster finally getting those reheated to fame notches after so many years of having to dodge questions about Chromatica by pointing to art pop being underappreciated. And of getting to rub it in the faces of the Katy Cats who were fighting for their lives defending Woman's World. It's about being right if you were on the Dochi train, or the Sabrina train, or the Chapel train in 2023 when people didn't get it yet, and now getting to ride the high of seeing everyone else catch up to you. And when you lose, all of this is done to explain why you were still right. If your political party lost, well, it's because they just didn't do what you said enough. If they won, they did. And sometimes you're right. Sometimes the spin is not really spin as much as an accurate assessment of reality. And trying to identify what's spin and what's fact and what's good faith and what's bad faith is one of the hardest parts of trying to understand our world. And what's more, on top of all of that, it's just a dark time in the world right now. Shit doesn't look too hot, and a lot of people are just desperate to get a win in somewhere. The narrative around Overwatch has been one of disappointment for so long that people are almost rooting for it as an underdog. They want to see it as the little game that could, in spite of being the game of the year not that long ago from, a small indie studio. When people construct narratives, it's not just about that narrative in isolation. It's about how all those narratives intersect with their own. People are going through a lot and have been for a while, and it's not hard to see why this narrative of shit got bad for a long time, but eventually was good again and everyone is happy, is the one that so many people are eager to construct and then cling onto with just an iron grip in the present day. It's also not hard to see why people who are feeling more pessimistic don't want to get their hopes up. Everything good has fallen apart, so not only do they not want to be optimistic about this, but misery loves company. Drag the others down with you. Pessimism and cynicism are the order of the day lately for a lot of people, and so of course that also seeps into things. Some people also didn't like Overwatch's diversity back in the day and are seeing the narrative swing more in their favor on that front, so they're incorporating it back into their version of this narrative, of their spin. And maybe the most important point that I'll leave you on is that very little of this is being consciously done. Very few people are aware of how they're approaching this process. It largely happens subconsciously for the most part as you process new information and find ways to contextualize it with what you know, what you think you know, and what you want to believe to be true. This is normal human behavior, not a sign of stupidity or something that only dumber people than you are going to do. You do it too. Maybe not about Overwatch, but about politics or sports or music or movies or TV shows or other games or even your real life. It is innately human to try and seek meaning in a chaotic world, to identify heroes and villains, protagonists and antagonists, to find structure so that you can find peace in it, to find a way to turn an overwhelming amount of information into something coherent enough that you can get out of bed in the morning without being crushed by the weight of it all. We look to other storytellers to help us in that process, and collectively we come to understand the narrative of the world we live in as a somewhat shared experience. And whether that's coming to agreement or clashing over it, it means trying to figure out what the story really is together. As much as it's frustrating to deal with when the narrative goes stupid, it's part of who we are. All we can do is be aware of our own proclivity for this subconscious tendency to construct the narrative to make sure we're not just guided by wishful thinking or stubbornness, or just a desire to be right over someone else. Alright, that felt kind of pretentious, so before we go too much further down that rabbit hole, this is where we're going to end this one. Thank you very much for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and consider becoming a channel member on YouTube or Patreon if you want to support the channel. I haven't actually gotten to make a video on a topic that was purely my own choice since back in September, like I said at the start, so I wanted to rush this one to make sure the topic is still fresh for people. The February Members' Choice video should be out next week, while the October Members' Choice video hopefully also will be coming out sometime in March because I made a severe lapse in judgment making a 6-hour video, and I'm still working through it. Anyways, speaking of Members' Choice videos, the March poll starts on Saturday, and it'll be between these 4 topics. The Culling, a cautionary tale about audience input. Making its 6th appearance as a Members' Choice option, this video would be about The Culling, an old battle royale game that came out right before the big BR boom and how its obsession with listening to audience feedback ultimately killed it. Making the case for Roll Queue. A returning topic from January, this video would be an attempt to make the case for Roll Queue, both within the context of Overwatch's implementation of it and Marvel Rivals' decision not to follow suit. Drag Race and the Death of Competition. Making its 3rd appearance in these polls, this video would be about how competitions die competitive deaths, using RuPaul's Drag Race as the case study into how a strong competitive format can be weakened over time. Lastly, we've got how Buried Stars gets social media toxicity right. A returnee from November, this video would be a return to Buried Stars, focusing specifically on how it portrays social media toxicity through its Twitter stand-in Fader, and how that toxicity impacts each of the characters differently. If you'd like to vote for one of these topics, memberships start at $5 a month through either YouTube or Patreon, with links to both in the description. Channel memberships are legitimately a huge part of what makes it possible to put so much time and effort into this stuff, especially during the first few months of the year when ad rates are pretty low, so if you can afford it, your support would be greatly appreciated. Speaking of, it's time to thank my channel members. At the $25 Elite membership tier, thank you to Jules Coolness. At the $10 Premium membership tier, thank you to Tortoise, and Jatenar, and A Ghostbad. At the $5 channel membership tier, thank you to MiniQ, Cage the Orc, Fish Toast, Alex Stone, Nemo the Survivor, Dexiny, Yoshi of the Wire, Cadence, Windex the Great, DeLeathers, Gavoss, Marsh Alice, Crimson Cyclo, Good Guy Luis, Corey, MV, The Only Enigma, Mariah, Amon Dadley, Meat Cubed, Noisy Pitta, Harv, Marcy Gaskill, Deku _ Safon, and T. Laskin. Whether you're a channel member, a subscriber, or you just clicked on this video out of curiosity, thank you very much for watching, and I hope I'll see you around again soon.